Welcome to the second in this series, discussions of the central nervous system. We initially talked about the anatomy. Sorry, it went on a bit longer than I had hoped, and I'm hoping that this one will be brief and we can get through it in a shorter period of time. So apparently it takes nearly 2 hours to just do an overview of the anatomy. I'm sorry about that. But let's now try to put that anatomy into the first set of contextual features. And these are the more challenging ones, where you can't really just identify a very particular circuit and say, you know, the information starts here and ends here, like we see with a very simple neural reflex, where we know that the pinprick at the tip of the finger is delivered to the spinal cord, where it doesn't feel good, and immediately the output says your response should be to withdraw the finger from the pin. And as we know, as I'm apologizing for something that I did previously and things like that, there are times when there is some type of sensory system reflex that is interrelated to a cognitive system and interassociated, if you will, with a behavioral state system, and still converges within the CNS as an integration system for a motor system output, and in my case, a behavior, the motor behavior of the speech apparatus to express my emotion somewhere here coming from the cognitive and the behavioral state system. So let's look at this a little more directly and seriously then. But it certainly allows us to apply it to nearly any situation, and that's why this is presented with the discussion of reflex pathways in the brain. It is more complex, and the emergent properties are quite astounding, as we know. So there is some type of primary sensory system, and it is still modeled after that individual unit of input, integration, and output at the cellular level. And of course, the authors in this chapter, in this edition, say that some scientists are preferring that, or recommending that the functional unit of the nervous system actually be represented in this fashion on the grander scale of collections of neurons with this emergent property of some type of input, integration, and output, because you can even project it to these very large systems that have more associational or horizontal or interneuronal integration, greater levels of complexity. So the sensory system, like the primary somatosensory cortex, as you will see, certainly is involved in higher level oversight of the spinal cord reflex system, and communicates that to our cognitive system, which is of course voluntary, and the behavioral state system that is really quite complex. Sometimes you wonder just how voluntary or involuntary this may be. But certainly there are horizontal or internal or local circuits that interrelate the two. We certainly hope that someone is using their cognitive abilities, their executive decision making capabilities, to oversee their behavior. And our fit of rage example was a very good one, I think. Now, in different conditions, the intrinsic inhibitory system, as we've considered repeatedly, can fall out of homeostasis, one way to put it, or become faulty, and behavioral expressions are quite inappropriate for the setting. Consider, for example, general anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, with the cognitive decline of certain neurodegenerative diseases. Alzheimer's disease is a primary example. The behavioral state system really becomes, unfortunately, absurd is probably not the best word to use, but if you have a family member that experiences this or have worked in this type of a setting or just visited this type of a setting, someone at a nursing home or whatever, and you see someone just appearing to be writhing in pain and moaning and groaning for no apparent reason, it may indeed represent this dissociation between the systems, just not being able to make sense of the environment and having a voluntary control over the behavioral states that have evolved to emerge and protect us and help contribute to the survival mechanisms of the organism. And certainly in general, this is the representation within the central nervous system continuing to the spinal cord. And the authors chose to use the collective efferent term, or a term for the collective efferent system, calling it the motor system. And it's a bit archaic in my opinion because they include the endocrinology as well. But classically, the motor output, the motor system of the nervous system was all-inclusive of any efferent output. So you get the coordinated, complete physiological and hopefully appropriate, right, physiological response and or behavior. So the behavioral state and the cognition influence the brain output, as you know. And sometimes they are in series, and sometimes they work in parallel circuits. So this would be a series if you went this way, or a series if you went this way, but also parallel if you just follow the arrows on the other side. And we mentioned reciprocating circuits a few times, and actually all of these really should be reciprocating because there's always some type of a neural circuit feedback to let the sources of input know or have some idea, if you will, of what the final decision was for an output. And this contributes to the coordinated, complete output. And, learning to make it more appropriate over time by being attentive to the environment. So if you behave a certain way in a social setting, and everyone is shocked and shame you, hopefully you would modify that behavior when opportunities arise for it to be repeated, and it would become more and more appropriate. So children learn this way, and our morality and ethics help us to do such things. You might cheat on an exam or a quiz and then feel guilty and then never do it again. Or you might cheat and get caught and pay the price and think about it differently in the future. So the cerebral cortex, then, we are thinking from a functional viewpoint that it can be divided into the three specializations as we had indicated when we looked at the anatomy: the sensory, motor, and association areas. So the sensory input is translated into perception or awareness, and as we'll see, the complete picture assembled via perception within the cerebral cortex, or the cerebral hemispheres altogether, might be a bit different than the original sensory structure. But it has evolved to that level to contribute maximally to understanding the environment and meeting the two objectives or goals of every living organism: survival and reproduction. So the motor areas direct the skeletal muscle movement, as we know, and then the association areas integrate information from sensory and motor areas and can direct the voluntary behaviors. Now, what unfortunately is left out from this is that the involuntary nervous system is equally, well, not necessarily brain mass-wise, but of importance, equally represented at the cortical levels. So with new functional visualization methods, we know that visceral sensory representation and motor output is also represented or of consequence to neuronal activity in many areas of the cerebral cortex and subcortical areas. So we do need to keep that in mind, but classically, of course, we think of the somatic sensory, somatic motor, and the general association areas. And again, remember, the sensory here is all the senses, so vision, vibration, each of the particular types of sensations that we will talk about, special sensory or general sensory, or visceral sensory, they are sensory modalities. So we have the idea in this association area, the idea emerges of bimodal, multimodal, certainly at the higher end, to where somehow every sensory input to the organism, from the visceral afferents to the somatic afferents to the special afferents, vision and smell and things like that, converge ultimately and become integrated into the output from one cortical area, say into the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, where you start comparing it to what you've experienced in the past, what already resides in the brain, and you resolve any, you do a comparison and contrast, and you resolve the differences and make some type of judgment and decision to behave, to generate a coordinated, complete response to that novel environmental input, and then afterward you assess the effectiveness. Was it a successful survival strategy? Is the example I like to go to at all times. So this slide is showing us some of the major functional areas of the cerebral cortex, and again, even within the primary somatosensory cortex, remember we identified this as the central sulcus, and the post-central gyrus is toward the back of the brain, and the precentral gyrus is toward the front of the brain, toward the nose, the rostral level. Even though we call it the primary somatosensory cortex, there are several different sensory modalities that emerge here: pain and temperature, vibration, positional sense. So it is a site of convergence of multimodal sensory information, but it's the first location in the cortex, of course, that receives it, and then it shares it with nearby areas, and of course the opposite side, as we'll see in a moment. So the parietal lobe, the remainder of the parietal lobe, is a major somatosensory, and again the visceral sensory association area. There is not very much visceral sensory information that makes its way to the primary somatosensory cortex, but there are some other areas, actually earlier cortex, the cingulum, if you recall that. The cingulate cortex, gyrus, is one of the primary areas, and then you see these deeper ones here. This is some older brain, and you see some of the older functions like taste appearing in there. This is, you might recognize this as the insula. It's a little island of cerebral cortex hidden away deep to the frontal and temporal lobes. So we are seeing them in there. And so some, the primal, and certainly taste, it's a special visceral afferent, so it's special. The smell is also in this area, but I think that's on the temporal lobe, but still it's kind of the older cortex. This is on the temporal lobe because, remember, we said the sense of smell goes almost directly to the hippocampus. So this is the lateral surface of the temporal lobe. If we went deep in to the more medial portion, we would find the amygdala sitting in front of the hippocampus. Do you recall that imagery there? So some of the temporal lobe, the deeper parts on the inside surface, if you will, because it's cortex, right, is older cortex and feeds into the hippocampus as well. So it's kind of the same story. The older hippocampus, the older cortex, the paleocortex as it's called, archicortex is the newer, neocortex, is the newer part. Obviously, new, right? So all the surface we're seeing here is neocortex, and this is some of the paleo and archicortex, the older types of cortex. There's not as many cell layers either. And we see some of the more primal, if you will, sensory inputs. These special senses evolved long before the neocortex did. So I hope that helps to make that point. But that information, via spreading, can make its way into the prefrontal cortex, into the sensory association areas, and the visceral sensory information, when it becomes associated with a cognitive function or just making sense of your world, might be arriving at the more distal dendrites and neurons and having a more moderate or lesser input into the neurons. So hopefully you recall those long dendrites of the cerebral cortex neurons and receiving input throughout the length, and there is a lamination of the input, and as we saw in the earlier lectures of the neurophysiology, if you have synaptic input right on the proximal dendrites and right near the trigger zone, you can have a more potent effect on the neuron, whether you are excitatory, inhibitory, or modulatory, right? Like a metabotropic receptor that might have some effect on the membrane potential, bringing it closer to threshold or farther away from threshold, if you recall that. So try to keep all of that level of anatomy in mind when you're picturing this. So this primary somatosensory information reaching the neurons in this cortical area are going to have potent inputs. And then there'll be other information, mostly the reciprocal kind of information, like from the thalamus back and forth to the thalamus otherwise, or to other nearby areas like the primary motor cortex, to help integrate the information of, so okay, I received this primary somatosensory information, I sent it to you, what did you do with it? Right? Give me the feedback, and things of that nature. So we have extended a bit beyond just what the some sensory association area would do, but this is very important. Also, you'll see that this is one of the areas of the cerebral cortex kind of coming into the visual, the occipital and the temporal lobes here, where some of our long-term memories persist. Doesn't mean that if you pull out just this part here, you lose a particular memory, but this capability of associating a broad range of information that's been stored and then feed it into other areas so it gets to the hippocampus, into the prefrontal cortex for that comparator function, and you start assembling things. And we'll see an example at the end of receiving visual information and generating speech, or receiving auditory information and generating speech. So we've mentioned before that the occipital lobe contains the primary visual cortex and the visual association area, and the temporal lobe we now see receives the primary auditory cortex, primary auditory sensory information on the superior temporal gyrus is the term for it. And then right nearby, of course, is the auditory association area. So this is what I was saying, there's some local circuitry involved in these arrows that are going all over the place here too. So there's more long range, like getting out here to the sensory association area, but there's also very local associations going on as well, and it builds and builds and builds and builds. So over billions of neurons, right? And then the special senses, the gustatory and the olfactory, they are where we mentioned before. And then the primary motor is in the precentral gyrus of the frontal cortex, and then immediately in front of that, or rostral to that, is the motor association area, also called the premotor area, or the supplemental motor area, and then the prefrontal association area. So the way to think of the frontal cortex, which is largest in humans, is that it is what links our motor expressive behaviors, our affective behaviors, which includes the look on your face and the things that you say, right? It's all motor when you think of it that way. How we express ourselves within the environment, how we position ourselves and move ourselves in the environment relative to who we are, what our life experiences are, what we have learned, and how we assemble that into executable, coordinated behavioral, physiological, and endocrinological responses within our environment. So in someone with a prefrontal lobotomy, that content of self gets separated from the capabilities of expressing self within our environment. Well, obviously, as you know, throughout these areas, and you should get oriented here almost immediately, somewhere within here we have the I think they're showing these crossing both the primary motor and primary sensory cortex. But certainly with the eyeballs here, it lets you know that this is rostral, the nose would be up here, and this is caudal. So we know occipital is going to have visual, and then the sensory motor is going to be about halfway up, crossing the parietal and the frontal cortex, right? So the speech center is going to be down lower. I do want to, oh, they've got it pulled aside, but there's a little lip thing here that they've pulled aside. It's called the operculum. So the precentral gyrus comes down and takes just like a little turn, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. It takes this little turn, and that's the speech center. It's still a motor area, right? Controls the muscles that are coordinating the larynx and the oral cavity and tongue and lips and all that stuff to formulate speech and to express a motor behavior within our external environment. Excuse me. So we are thinking of this situation where the corpus callosum is connecting the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. And this is in the context of functional lateralization within the cerebral cortex. So each lobe has special functions. So we'll point out again and again that the motor and sensory systems cross to the opposite side of the brain. Why this evolved, I really don't know. I haven't had an opportunity to read any theoretical presentations on that, but certainly they're showing the right hand with the pencil in it being reflected for the person that would be right-handed and writing with their right hand. So if you have a stroke in the left cortex, then you would lose the ability to write with your dominant hand. You would have to train the opposite side, right? So there is plasticity, as you know. It's better when we're younger and not so good when we are older. So the writing tends to be on the left for a right-handed preference person. Analysis by touch, more so with the left hand thereby. The speech is on the left. Even though the similar motor area is here, the side that is activated predominantly with the speech will be on the left-hand side. We see the auditory cortex for the right ear is on the left, the auditory cortex for the left ear is on the right, so even that crosses. And then, of course, the visual system is the same. The The right visual field is represented in the left primary visual cortex or occipital cortex. So we can follow this up ultimately to get to there's a couple of synapses along the way here, but anyway, we see it represented in the optic nerve coming out to the retina. So in the right eye, the left retina is picking up the right field of view, coming straight in, and you see crossing over. The left retina of the left eye also is picking up the right visual field, and that's all carried to the left hemisphere. So left retinas go to the left hemisphere, and then the right hemisphere visual cortex within the occipital cortex is picking up the left visual field, which is the right, shown in red here, the right retina on each side, the right eye, right retina, and the left eye, right retina. Are you following all that? Anyway, that's not the primary emphasis of the presentation. It's more so that I want you to get a general feel for the way that the visual fields are split and represented on the retina and carried to the contralateral side. I mean, it's contralateral in one sense. The left goes to the right, and the right visual field goes to the left. I won't push it beyond that. So now let's begin to think of other features of sensory information. So the primary somatosensory cortex, or somatic sensory cortex, somatosensory will just be either a hyphenated word or a complex word by putting them together without the hyphen. The termination point of pathways from the skin, the musculoskeletal system. And here they're putting in the viscera. So I don't like that. Anyway, just recall it the way that I described it before. The primary visceral sensory cortical areas are not at the same anatomical location as the primary somatosensory areas. You know, so we caught I forget the name of the person that comes up on every first slide there. If you say primary somatic sensory cortex, you don't say viscera. The viscera has its other target cortical areas. So the somatosensory pathways are touch, temperature, pain, itch, and body position. Now, as you know, there's referred pain, so like appendicitis, which is a visceral pain, gets referred to a somatic area, so that might be the confusion that was made here. And it is our sensory system being confused that we get the referred pain, but thank goodness we do, because clinically it's useful. And obviously we're going to talk about these in more detail as we go through the sensory physiology. So the special senses: visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, which is taste. So we pointed those out already, and they are processed into perception. So either the unimodal sensory information is processed into perception, like visual. What is actually occurring at the retina, the physical construction of the information that is hitting the retina is reconstructed and even modified within the visual cortex. But by the time we get to the hippocampus, the visual cortex, auditory, and primary somatosensory, and olfactory, and gustatory all come in together, somehow organized into an encoded neuron input to the hippocampus. It's patterned because there's neurons over space and time, right? It's not just a single neuron feeding into the hippocampus. It's many hundreds of thousands, most likely, maybe 1 million or so. So they're carrying the multimodal information into there. But as you know, olfactory memories are extremely potent. So that somehow has a direct input into the hippocampus to contribute to recall and reconstruction of complex memories. Anyway, so the perception is not only at the high end of cognitive and associative functions of the cortex, where it's very multimodal. It can be at the unimodal level of individual sensory information being perceived. In other words, kind of reconstructed into something that is a biological representation of the actual physical environment. So there are three major types of the motor system, and this is the part I was telling you about. I would prefer to put the term efferent system there because these are the final common pathways of what we are talking about. I mentioned that term before. So there are three major types of final common pathways: the general somatic efferent, the skeletal muscle movement, the somatic motor division, and general visceral efferent for the autonomic or the voluntary nervous system, the involuntary nervous system, and then the neuroendocrine signals that are kind of on their own but separated, and we've talked about those: the hypothalamus, the endocrine hypothalamus, neuroendocrine hypothalamus, and the adrenal medulla. And certainly the voluntary movement, as we are aware, requires the primary motor cortex. You probably, hopefully recall in the prior presentations talking about the upper motor neuron in the primary motor cortex, whose axon goes all the way down into the brainstem for a brainstem motor neuron, which would be called the lower motor neuron, that will send its axon, the final common pathway, straight out to the skeletal muscle. So you're one synapse away from the primary motor cortex. You're one synapse away from the neuromuscular junction. Two synapses away from the muscle, but anyway, one synapse away from the neuromuscular junction, which in itself is a synapse. And so the motor association areas are involved before then. So there's, think of someone who's about to compete in an Olympic event or something like that. They are running information through their brain. They are actually performing the task before they discharge it, right? Before they hear the gun or the whistle or whatever it is, and that's the cue to discharge what they've been practicing in their motor association area and the basal ganglia that we talked about before. And actually the release of dopamine in the basal ganglia is essential for the initial steps of discharging a coordinated motor response. Therefore, Parkinson's disease is not so much an involuntary tremor that occurs early on because being able to prevent initiation of smaller motor sets of motor neurons begins to occur early on, and that's why you get the resting tremors. But as more and more of the dopamine neurons are lost, a Parkinson's patient can know exactly what they want to do. They're telling their motor system that I want to walk across the room, and in the clinic you can instruct them, have them stand up, you help them stand up, and say, okay, walk from here to the wall over there, turn around and come back. And in their brain, they're putting it together and they're telling their body to do it, but the dopamine isn't released in the basal ganglia to have them do it. Give them just a little nudge. Obviously, you don't push them over on the floor, but you help them get started with gentle guidance. And once it's started, then the full motor behavior can be expressed just as instructed. So that's one major way to think about the dopamine innervation of the basal ganglia. And then obviously with Huntington's chorea, the basal ganglia, once it is given permission to go ahead by the dopamine, is involved in contributing to a smooth, complex, coordinated, planned set of muscular contractions and relaxations. We're not ignoring the conscious level of the primary motor cortex and the cerebellum. We're trying to think about each little piece and part as we're going through. And obviously these are just scratching the surface for when we talk about the motor system and the sensory systems, but I like to obviously jump in every now and then, as you can tell. So now let's extend to something that's a little more difficult to evaluate and assess. Behavioral states and mood and motivation and things like that. So you tell somebody to stand up and walk over across the room to the wall, turn around and come back. That's very different than trying to determine if somebody is clinically depressed or truly has an anxiety disorder and things like that. So let's begin to think of this idea of a behavioral state. It certainly is, I mean, they're real. We can't deny that. They are emergent properties from neural networks, and there's a neurochemistry to it, and there's a neurophysiology to it, like action potentials and firing rates and things like that. But exactly what they are, as far as representations within the neural networks, is still a very open question. We can do a lot with them, and as we learn more and more, hopefully we can contribute greater benefits to all organisms that can benefit, especially humans, certainly. So the modulator of sensory and cognitive processes is what we are thinking about as the emergent properties of those neural networks. The neurons collectively are known as diffuse modulatory systems, so nothing's in one particular location. One of the types of organizations is in the lower brainstem, the pons, and in part the medulla. And neurons are, because there's so many axons passing through that portion of the brainstem, the neurons are not nicely clustered as nuclei. They're kind of spread around with a lot of fibers running through them, so that it's recalled as the reticular formation in the brainstem. So we have so far talked about kind of a diffusely spread associational system at the highest level in the cortex, and that spread system within the cortex, as well as the definitive areas, are primary targets of some of these reticular formations in the brainstem, as we will see. So there are 4 diffuse modulatory systems: the noradrenergic, the serotonergic, the dopaminergic, and the cholinergic. So we've talked about these neurotransmitters already. 2 of these are, well, 3 of them are monoamines, 2 of them are catecholamines. There is some epinephrine, the adrenergic system, represented, but it is minor compared to noradrenergic. And the serotonergic is a potent one. If you certainly you've heard about ecstasy that acts on the serotonergic system. LSD also acts through the serotonergic system, so very potent. And we're reflecting on the dopaminergic as we proceed. Recall that we talked about the nucleus accumbens in the ventral forebrain, and that it was very much involved in reward types of behaviors, reinforcing types of behavioral responses, and very important in understanding substances of abuse and how they become addictive. And the cholinergic, certainly, we've mentioned. So what we want to do now, remember the cholinergic we talked about in the context of Alzheimer's disease too, so higher levels of function, and that's pretty much what we're talking about here, not just in the neuromuscular junction or the autonomic nervous system. So these diffuse modulatory systems are set up as 4 separate systems. They have sites of the origin of the neurons, So where the nucleus is located in the messenger RNA to produce the enzymes that are going to generate these molecules. Remember, these are not gene products. They are modified amino acids, as we see above here, and then the cholinergic is kind of by itself. So the genes for the enzymes, the biosynthetic and degradative enzymes, are what we are talking about within the soma of the neurons, and then the axons pass through several pathways to receive their targets. So the structures that the neurons innervate are next. So we always talk about the site of origin and the target for neuronal circuits and pathways, and then functions that would be modulated by the system. So the noradrenergic system is responsible for synthesizing and releasing. Didn't say secrete, just said release, as in the synaptic vesicular release, norepinephrine. The locus ceruleus of the pons, ceruleus means blue, so it's actually, in a fresh specimen, a blue streak right at the base of the cerebellar peduncles where they connect to the pons. When you're looking through the roof, through the floor of, when you remove the roof of the fourth ventricle and you're looking down under the floor of the fourth ventricle, you can actually see the blue streaks on each side where the cerebellar peduncles attach. So the axons from these neurons ascend and reach the cerebral cortex, so they're diffusely distributed, some areas more than others, and into the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the olfactory bulb, the cerebellum, the midbrain, and then others descend to the spinal cord. So the pons is below the midbrain, so these are still ascending fibers here. And actually one of the targets within the midbrain of the locus ceruleus noradrenergic neurons are the serotonergic neurons. And there is an interaction between the axon terminals of the noradrenergic system and the serotonergic system in the forebrain. And it's a very interesting story, and clinically for behavioral states and affective mood disorders, it's critical to understand that. So noradrenergic system controls the serotonergic system very potently. The noradrenergic system is critical for attention, arousal, the sleep-wake cycles, learning, memory, anxiety, pain, and mood. The serotonergic system is the raphe nuclei right in the brain midline. So I told you that the locus ceruleus is bilateral. There's one on each side of the pons. The serotonergic system, the right and the left parts, stay close to each other. They're kind of butterfly shaped, so there is a right and left, but they meet at the midline. And they are midline structures, even though they spread a little bit away from the midline, and the raphe is the term that refers to midline. The lower nuclei project to the spinal cord, and they're involved in pain and locomotion, as well as significant impact on the autonomic nervous system. The upper nuclei project to most of the brain and are involved in the sleep-wake cycle, mood and emotional behaviors such as aggression and depression. And obviously, as you are aware, with LSD, the sensory perception mechanisms of the forebrain, the cerebral cortex in particular. So people that take LSD have a very altered perception of the world around them while they are experiencing the effect of the drugs. So serotonin helps us to make sense of the world in stabilizing the perceptive functions of the cortical neurons. So and it's hard to picture how that happens within a neuron, but anyway, it does, and it is real. So the dopaminergic system, dopamine is the transmitter. We talked about the substantia nigra on either side of the midbrain, and then in the middle, the ventral tegmentum within the midbrain is where we find the reward center, the dopamine neurons that project to the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala, and a few other of the limbic areas. It talked about the septal area, and contribute to reward and good feelings and stuff like that, as components of being happy, right? Definitely this system is very activated during sexual arousal and sexual satisfaction, I guess would be the term, how to state it politely here. And then, excuse me, also related to satiety for food intake. I mean, you think of it, reward that is associated with reinforced behaviors essential for survival and reproduction. You find a good spot where you, find really nice ripened fruit or something at a particular time of year. Think of elephants, the memories that they have. There has to be a rewarding, reinforcing component to that behavioral expression, such that you would want to repeat it. And reproduction is kind of in the same context, right? And certainly we've talked about the substantia nigra projecting to the cortex. Oh, you are so wrong. Quite obviously the basal ganglia is what we're talking about here. The subcortical basal ganglia is the biggest one for the substantia nigra. Some of the dopaminergic projections get beyond there, but it is not cortex. Scratch that one. That's really wrong. It is the basal ganglia. The cholinergic acetylcholine is at the base of the cerebrum, the pons, and the midbrain. And then there's also, just below the nucleus accumbens, there's a set of cholinergic neurons up in that part of the older cerebrum. Well, that's the base of the cerebrum that they talked about there. Okay. These are sites of cholinergic neurons in the septal area too. The targets distributed throughout the cerebrum, the hippocampus, and the thalamus. And they are obviously involved in sleep-wake cycles, arousal, learning, memory, sensory information passing through the thalamus. And why they do not have cognitive function here, I don't know. They have it represented in learning and memory, but we need that actual term of cognition that is somewhat encompassing across much of this here, included because we know that acetylcholine, some of these neurons in the base of the cerebrum and then later the pons in the midbrain degenerate earliest with Alzheimer's disease, as I had described before. So the dopaminergic system, the substantia nigra, the nigrostriatal system, not cortex, the nigrostriatal system is what degenerates in Parkinson's disease. Cholinergic degeneration is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Dysfunction of the serotonergic system and the noradrenergic system is associated with affective mood disorders such as depression, and what's the one of the manic depression? Good gosh, forgetting my terms there. Sorry about that. Also general anxiety disorders, panic disorders, and are somewhat involved in at least treating post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are different mechanisms that are affecting neurons at target sites with the post-traumatic stress disorder. Anyway, there are obviously other courses that you might take if those are great interest to you, and many other types of neurochemical messengers and neuromodulators that are involved. So many different techniques, most post-mortem, have allowed us to investigate the brain and come to know virtually everything we've seen so far, or from traumatic damage, stroke, or traumatic brain injury. there are limits to what we have learned from those sources of information. And certainly the functional imaging techniques, some of them a bit invasive, but not like having to open the skull and go in and electrically stimulate the brain or whatever, although much of that work has been done too. But it is limited. The non-invasive or minimally invasive imaging, functional imaging techniques like the positron emission tomography or the PET scan shown here is really important. And we've learned a tremendous amount from that. So here we see, and the literature is just building so rapidly, it's phenomenal. The areas of the brain that light up, and you can see the color scale for minimal activity to maximal activity. For hearing words, so the primary auditory cortex was in this area with the associational areas, and we're going to begin to discuss how the flow of this information is related to taking what you hear to the oral cavity to say it, right, to repeat it. And you can see that we're beginning to see some of the areas that are lit up here at lower levels, down in the blue or green areas, are lit up to all the way to the white for speaking words. So here are the motor areas, but at the same time that you're speaking words, you're anticipating hearing them, and you're hearing them to make sure you say them correctly, right? So as we speak, if we misspeak, we are charging this area, the primary auditory and associational auditory areas, saying, listen to what you're saying, and when you make a mistake, hear it, correct it, find what is the correction, and then make that correction. So we see hints of that aspect of the feedback system, right? And then we are in the upper right panel here, seeing the primary visual cortex, obviously, and the associational visual cortex, bringing that information close to, and we see it lighting up as green here, some of the auditory associational areas that are also activated to some degree simply by speaking words. So we see we're beginning to get the links between seeing words and speaking words, and hearing words and speaking words. So these are external origin of the cues to integrate and execute an instructed output of the motor system, correct? Well, now, what if we try to think of them ourselves, as me giving these talks? Sometimes the system fails on me, right? And I still can't pull that term out. Gosh darn it, I'm in the blue here. I'm in the blue. I should be in the red. Okay. So generating words from the prefrontal cortex. So you see that we're not all the way to the front end, or even on the medial aspect of it. We're kind of on the lateral side here, where it's lit up the most. We're charging this area, getting it ready to send the executive order to the nearby area. You can see that this is not superimposed upon this. It's just a bit in front of it. So it's gearing it up to send it to here and trigger this response. And obviously other areas are being prepared or recruited to help put together what we are about to execute. So it's really fun to look at these and interpret them that way. And then we see the perception, right? So what is actually physically here on this left panel is not what our brain wants to focus on and to generate. It wants to generate, and it even probably, if you're able to see it clearly, is making this a slightly darker shade than this here. So it's adding contrast, telling you that there is a square there where indeed there isn't. There's just four of these little semicircular things with a little piece of pie cut out, and then these little tents, right? Teepees or whatever, sitting in space. They're just floating there. They're not sitting on any kind of a rectangle, a square box, right? And then this one gives us the perception of three-dimensional depth, but it's really just a two-dimensional image. So the brain has this power of perception to construct what is represented from the sensory input, and sometimes create things that indeed truly are not there. Well, now let's just go through the illustrations of the site of origin of those four modulatory systems, the diffuse modulatory systems, and then look a little bit at the projection pathways and the target sites. So the first was the norepinephrine from the locus ceruleus, so they do show it in blue, and it has projections to the cerebellum, to descend to the spinal cord, and then that ascend, so part of the ascending reticular activating system along with the raphe portion. You see the thalamus here, the hypothalamus, so coordinating sensory motor at this level of relay, sensory motor and emotive information at the thalamus, and at the same time directing some of the endocrine responses, and then going to the, it even goes through the nucleus accumbens here in the septal area, so some of the lower cognitive areas, but you see that it passes through the cingulum and innervates the cingulate cortex first, and then begins to spread through the rest of the cortex out over the side, and then as it comes back to the occipital lobe, it follows deeper in into the temporal lobe and innervates the hippocampus. So as noradrenergic neurons are recruited to be activated while you are in an aroused state or when you are alarmed, then they are first going to begin to heighten the sensory motor and emotive relays within the thalamus, and gear up for an endocrine response, get your emotions going, and also right in this area here they can pass out. Remember that pathway right through here that gets to the amygdala, so it can get to the amygdala pretty quickly, and these time delays are not that great. Get to the cingulate cortex to start associating, coordinating, pulling out information to put in to the circuit to start making sense of what just alerted you, correct? And then down into the hippocampus, finally by the time the information gets to the hippocampus, to sensitize the hippocampus to make these comparator functions and kind of speed up the capabilities to filter through the information. And you want to lead to the decision to execute a response quickly. Some of these are triggered very rapidly, like through the cerebellum or even locally within the midbrain. So you know when somebody you're studying and somebody comes in and says hello to you and you jump out of your seat, that's pretty quick. But anyway, we can see the progressive recruitment of the neural circuitry so that we heighten the abilities of the key components initially, and then very shortly thereafter impact inform the other areas that they need to contribute their information and get involved in the process of filtering the information and making sense of it and putting together, assembling a decision that is consistent with successful survival strategies from the past, right? And then the raphe nuclei are shown here, and you see the descending ones. So the caudal raphe are going to be descending, and the more rostral raphe in the midbrain are going to contribute to the cerebellum, as well as sneak around here to the temporal lobe, and then similar projections as with the noradrenergic system, but the serotonergic system takes a more direct route to get right to the cortex, and then sweeps around again to get into the hippocampus. One of the inputs, a major input to these RAF-A nuclei, these midbrain RAF-A nuclei, are not shown here, but branches coming off the ascending noradrenergic system. So as I said, the noradrenergic system is going to regulate the serotonergic neurons quite potently, actually, and also put the blue and the greens together. There's an interaction between the axons, or at least where they converge on the postsynaptic neurons, that is significant as well. So the many of the drugs that early on treated depression blocked both the norepinephrine and the serotonin reuptake proteins. Then after that, and had other effects like cholinergic effects and things of that nature that were less desirable. Then what emerged first were the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they worked quite well. They still had a bit of an effect on the norepinephrine reuptake transport protein, and now other treatments are emerging again, drugs that are more selective or very selective for norepinephrine reuptake, but that have a little bit of serotonergic and the norepinephrine reuptake. So this pharmacology and medical pharmacognia, I didn't pronounce that term correctly, but the development of new drugs is emerging. So for a while we thought it was important just to fix serotonin for affective disorders, and the early drugs that just affected a bunch of things, were useful, but had to get, the specificity. And then it turned out, because we were then able to dissect the effects, serotonin versus norepi versus dopamine versus cholinergic, we began to see that each contributed a little bit to the symptoms. So faultiness in more than one neurotransmitter system contributes to the symptoms, and then drugs that target each of the systems to a large degree or a minor degree were more or less effective in alleviating the symptoms. As you know, there really isn't a cure for many of the affective disorders, including depression. The dopamine system we've talked about in the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, and here they do show them projecting to the basal ganglia, so they got it this time. And then as well the ventral to the nucleus accumbens and septal area, and then through some of the prefrontal cortex, where again it's important that we associate reward and reinforcement with the decision-making processes, the working memory as it's called in the prefrontal cortex. And then the acetylcholine that we had mentioned, we'll just look at the basal forebrain nuclei here, tremendous projections to the cortex, and then through here, this is the septal area here, through the fornix into the hippocampus. But as well, these other projections make their way ultimately into the hippocampus as well. Remember, the cingulum, the pathway under the cingulate gyrus, comes right back down into the medial temporal lobe and gets information back to the hippocampus. So that's a common pathway for these transmitters to get in there. If they go into the frontal cortex first and the cingulate gyrus rostrally first, and then follow it dorsally and caudally. And there's other local and descending projections as well. So just looking at four transmitters, glutamate and GABA are going to be everywhere. So, you can't just show little collection of GABA neurons in one location in very broad projections. GABAergic GABA synthesizing neurons, or GABAergic neurons, are everywhere. And some have very limited local connections, and others have very long projecting connections. There are peptidergic systems that synthesize opioids, and then the glutamate system is extensive in neurons that have long projections and short projections and things like that. So typically you don't see these types of maps for the glutamate system. It's just these four that very interestingly have these very limited locations of these neuron cell bodies that synthesize them. Therefore, information is integrated only there to be spread to all these other areas. That's why they have these diffuse modulatory effects on the entire higher functioning nervous system, and even the lower functions, because they'll project to the spinal cord. So they also obviously are very important in each case. We mentioned attention and the sleep-wake cycle, and alertness and things like that. So obviously the activities of those four modulatory systems are going to change throughout the states of arousal, in particular the sleep cycle. So the electroencephalograms, or the EEGs, and the sleep cycle are some of the best known, although EEGs and many other states have been studied as well. And now they're being correlated with the PET scans, and there's functional MRI scans that let you see the anatomy in even greater detail with the activity levels superimposed that are just phenomenal. So as all these techniques are coming together, the EEGs, the oldest and most classical, and very well understood, but still growing and developing, especially with the integration of the other types of information. So there's much more that we're going to come to know about the nervous system through the combination of all these investigatory and clinical techniques. So with the EEGs, as you know, they're surface recordings off the scalp, and the underlying neurons generate a signal collectively that can be picked up through those, and they generate amplitude and frequency components to their signals that are quite unique. So we've talked about amplitude and frequency already. This is not an action potential or an EPSP. This is a representation of a population of neurons, a broad population of neurons throughout the nervous system that somehow produce an electromagnetic signal that penetrates the biological tissue and reaches the scalp surface. And then it's picked up by the electrodes and is representative of large populations of neurons, and typically kind of the cortical areas, but they can reflect deeper levels as well. So the reticular activation system keeps the conscious brain awake. So we see the alpha waves are short amplitude, high frequency when we are, and they appear when we are awake with the eyes closed. So what changes, in this case we have AM, amplitude modulation, and FM, frequency modulation, occurring simultaneously throughout different stages of sleep, wake, and consciousness. So it's low amplitude, high frequency is the alpha wave with the eyes closed when we are awake. And then the first stage of sleep, or stage one of sleep, the rapid eye movement stage, is a lower frequency but also a low amplitude. And these simply change as we go through the different stages of sleep. The slow wave, delta waves, corresponds to stage 4 of sleep, and these obviously are high amplitude lower frequency, right? So it's a progression, and there's both AM and FM features to it, right? And time is on our x-axis. So with sleep, then, there are 4 stages with two major phases. The slow wave sleep is where we adjust the body without conscious commands. The REM sleep is the brain activity that will inhibit the motor neurons to the skeletal muscle, paralyzing them. Then this is when dreaming takes place. And of course the rapid eye movement are the eyes moving, supposedly tracking what's going on in our dream. And then of course there is circadian rhythm superimposed not only upon the sleep-wake patterns, but many patterns, behavioral patterns and neuroendocrine patterns. So we've seen the circadian rhythm of melatonin, of body temperature, blood pressure, of adrenocortical steroids throughout these series of lectures. The endocrine system is where we talked about them the most. So a part of the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is very significantly involved in regulating these circadian rhythms, and is responsive or picks up signal from the melatonin. Very heavily innervated by serotonin projections from the midbrain raphe nuclei. But the neurons there in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's, relatively speaking, it's a very small nucleus. There's a right and a left, obviously. And the gene expression within the neurons is really quite unique and becoming more well understood, where there's a series of genes that will become expressed at certain times of the day. The light-dark cycle receives retina input, so it knows when it's light and when it's dark. These genes will be expressed, and then expression will be blocked. And then the proteins will be used and deteriorate. When they're used up, they're degraded and recycled, and then the genes will become expressed again. So this is a way of cyclically allowing or being permissive with gene expression and having a feedback system in place. So as the gene is expressed more, there's more feedback inhibition, so ultimately the gene expression gets turned off. The proteins last longer than the gene expression, and then when ultimately the proteins are destroyed, the feedback is alleviated and gene expression picks up again. So it's perfect biological system for setting up circadian rhythmicity. And we still don't understand it completely, but it's just in the past decade or so, it's now 2009, the past 2 decades, let me say then, we've learned a tremendous amount, especially with the availability of molecular techniques. Well, now let's talk a little bit about emotion and motivation. So we're getting to levels that are even more challenging to understand. So there's a link between emotions and physiological functions, as we know very well. And this is the thing, is that we know and understand these within ourselves. We can recognize them in other organisms and other human beings in particular, but other organisms truly, and stating exactly where they reside in the nervous system and how they are integrated and generated and executed is a real challenge. We know much of what's involved and a lot about certain areas that are very key, but this is probably an area of research that will continue forever. Can we ever really know exactly how all of this occurs and have any control over it, especially clinically, to cure neurological diseases, neuropsychological diseases that involve emotion and motivation? So the sensory stimuli, as we know, reaches the cerebral cortex. So it's always something about external and internal environment feeding in. So In panic disorder, many times a panic attack is triggered by someone who, for some reason, begins to pick up the somatic sensory information of feeling their heart beating against the chest wall. Most of the time we keep it suppressed with enough GABA so we can't feel it. When it is truly beating like crazy, we can feel it. But in some individuals with panic attacks, that even though the heart rate isn't up, the heart isn't beating and jumping out of their chest, they pick up the somatic sensory information, and that is integrated in the cerebral cortex erroneously as, oh my God, there's a reason to be alerted, and triggers, inappropriately triggers a stress response, a protective or defensive response. And when it's inappropriate and exaggerated, and the feedback doesn't blunt it or terminate it appropriately, then it's a panic attack, right? Does that make sense? So let's see how that would fit into this. So overall then, what organisms have evolved successfully to be able to do, to live and reproduce, you have to make sense of your environment, integrate it, regulate it through feedback mechanisms such that the coordinated, complex, complete behavioral response, output response, efferent response, is appropriate to the environmental stimuli or challenge, whether it's external or internal, correct? And these can be trained. So the prime one is if you have gas in your intestine and you're around other people, we are trained not just to release it, all that's involved with that, because we are trained that it is inappropriate to take others into account, and you excuse yourself to the restroom to relieve your gas there, correct? Anyway, that's one example of an internal stimulus rather than just an external, where you walk into a room, a crowded room, where you didn't expect there's going to be a lot of people there. How do you respond? Well, it comes into all the sensory information, sight, smell, sound, taste, whatever it is, comes into the cerebral cortex. The integration occurs within the association areas of the cerebral cortex. The integrated information reaches the limbic system and creates an emotion. There is feedback to create awareness of the emotion, and there's opportunities to adjust and correct and resolve before the final execution. The hypothalamus and the brainstem receive outputs from the limbic system, and this contributes to initiating the somatic motor response, but we know the cerebral cortex has a parallel circuit all the way down to here. For the voluntary and even unconscious responses, highly trained reflexive type of responses. Or you've been told your whole life not to relieve yourself of intestinal gas in public, so you appropriately excuse yourself while using your speech muscles and leave the room, but your butt cheek muscles are unconsciously contracted. Hope you're enjoying that little talk there. Anyway, move on. So autonomic, endocrine, and immune, right? Motivation, then, is defined as internal signals that shape voluntary behavior. So some states are known as drives. So we work with the autonomic and the endocrine responses as key components in our motivation, which in one sense is like a gearing up or a practicing of what is to be executed. So motivated behaviors also must be stopped, and satiety is one example. So hunger or thirst are primal motivated behaviors. Sexual drive is a primal motivated behavior. and satiety is a trigger to stop each of those, correct? And it's possible to have homeostatic imbalances with primal motivated behaviors. And this extends way beyond that, of course. Short-term goals, intermediate range goals, long-range goals that we are trained throughout our growth and development to develop and practice and express within our neural circuitry. So, a question would be, could someone set up short, medium range, and long range goals at the age of 25 if they spent, 25 years in a closet without anyone training them? And very likely it would be no. So these are emergent properties of developmentally generated, refined, and restructured features of our neural system, our complex neural circuitry. So these are similar to emotions, but they're longer lasting. So you might be unhappy for a while, but if you get depressed, then you'll be depressed for the rest of your life unless you have appropriate therapy and treatment. So the mood disorders are the fourth leading cause of illness worldwide today. So there's sleep and appetite disturbances, alteration of mood and libido, which is the sexual drive, just in case you didn't know that term. And the antidepressant drugs alter synaptic transmissions. So we reflected on those when we talked about serotonin and norepinephrine. So learning and memory then is one of the final ones we can consider here, and we've talked about it before, but this is where we'll present some definitions of types of memory. So we understand the circuitry of the hippocampus and the cingulate gyrus and the pathways and the prefrontal cortex and the sensory association cortex of the parietal cortex and those various things. And obviously the temporal cortex is very important. It feeds into the hippocampus also. So there's two broad types of learning, associative and non-associative. The non-associative are such as habituation and sensitization. Associative, the classic, is Pavlov. So it's not the purview of this course to become an expert in these distinctions. You would most likely take a course, a psychology course, to learn more about these. But basically, we are very often associating one or more things with one or more other things, and in some organisms, you get a very powerful reflexive response. Well, all of us salivate at the sight or sound of foods or meals or things being cooked or the thought of stuff like that. So there's some capabilities for us to salivate, when we hear the ding of the oven. I don't know, but it's not always that way as the Pavlov dog. And then we have a basic understanding of these. So memory has several types. There's short-term and long-term. These we know well. We can remember something for the exam. We purge it, and it doesn't become long-term memory, unfortunately. Reflexive and declarative. So these are defined in the textbook, and I won't take more of your time here to do it. I'll refer you to the text to get the brief descriptions and definitions that are provided there. So the memory processing then can be illustrated this way. Information input, so it's a multimodal input typically with the short-term memory. This is the hippocampus. And then there is processing and consolidation. That's the circuitry that we did through the fornix to the hypothalamus to the thalamus to the cingulate gyrus back to the hippocampus, with sharing with the parietal association cortex and the prefrontal cortex. And when all those other areas are involved to transcend the short-term memory to something that is more permanently accessible, then it is shifted to the long-term memory. And there's a substantial amount of evidence that this transition, this shifting out of the hippocampus to higher cortical areas like the parietal cortex, but they're spread around, as we had said, the long-term memory, that consolidation process actually occurs during sleep. So that's one of the ideas, one of the theories of sleep. But it can happen otherwise too. I mean, there are some times, as you know, an event will happen and it goes from short-term memory to long-term memory right there on the spot. You don't have to take a nap to have it transition over. But it is very well established that much of consolidation occurs on a day-to-day basis with long-term memory. In other words, if you study really hard one day and get good sleep, you actually will have a long-term memory, more long-term memory of that collective information the next day for the exam than if you stay up all night cramming and go in and just try to work off the short-term memory. Anyway, it all works collectively. So remember the hippocampus. Remember that reverberating circuit of the information getting to the hippocampus, whether it originates within, where you're saying, "Oh, I need this information," or triggered from out with an external directive or command. The hippocampus through the fornix to the septal area and the hypothalamus, and then from the hypothalamus to the thalamus, and then from the septum and the thalamus to the cingulate gyrus, and then back to the hippocampus, and it recruits the other circuits along the way. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, to locate and recall, saying, okay, here's the basic structure of the information coming through my short-term memory system again. Send the signal out to all you guys radiating out from the cingulate gyrus. You out there, the parietal cortex and the prefrontal cortex, kind of sift through it all, locate and recall what matches this or comes closest, and then let's get an output. Excuse me. So here's a little bit more information about the types of long-term memory. So there is the reflexive or the implicit memory, as we saw in the previous slide, and the declarative or explicit memory. So the reflexive implicit memory is recall is automatic and does not require conscious attention. The declarative memory, we recall things with a conscious effort. There has to be attention to it. There is a slower acquisition through repetition for the implicit memory, whereas the declarative or explicit memory depends on higher level thinking skills such as inference, comparison, and evaluation. The implicit memory includes the motor skills and the rules and procedures, whereas the declarative, the memories are reported verbally. And then the implicit has a final descriptor. The procedural memories can be demonstrated. Now we'll look at the last couple slides here and consider language, excuse me, and some of the disorders related to differentially localized brain damage, what would be the losses. So the cerebral processing and the spoken and the visual language are what we're going to consider here anatomically. We saw the PET scans earlier, and now we're trying to put the circuitry together. So damage to Wernicke's area causes receptive aphasia. Well, Wernicke's area is very close by or even part of the primary auditory associational area. Remember, the primary auditory cortex was the superior temporal gyrus, and right nearby was the auditory association area. Well, this very discrete area just on the temporal cortex, but at the deepest part, the innermost part of the lateral fissure here, and it's obviously with the junction with the parietal cortex, and the occipital cortex is over here. Here's that one little notch there and little notch there that you can use to separate parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Anyway, this special little spot here is the Wernicke's area, And then that other part on the operculum we talked about, remember the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex, takes that little turn right there, and it's a little lip type of a thing that you can pull away to see the insula deep in there. And that is lit up with speech, remember? So that's Broca's area. So so here we are reading the words, so we speak a written word. So remember that the visual cortex lit up, and then this area here that I was telling you was near the association, auditory association area, that is Wernicke's area. So this is where we receive information and begin to structure what we want to express. And then Broca's area is where we structure it and send it to the motor areas for the final common pathway actually to express it. So you might, in the case of receptive aphasia, you might be able to express yourself well for information that is where you are generating the words from within your brain. But if they give you a piece of paper with something on it and say, read these, the information, the visual information gets garbled somehow because of damage here, and what you end up saying could be completely different, absolutely bizarre, and have nothing to do with what was on the piece of paper. Or you simply might say, well, I can't say what's on the paper, so that's the expressive aphasia. Receptive aphasia, excuse me. The expressive aphasia is when there's damage to Broca's area. So remember, there's a branch of the middle cerebral artery that comes in this area, and it's very common that you have major strokes to this area. So it's possible to have it be back here a bit more and more of a receptive aphasia, or up here a little bit more, or both, and you get both problems. But it is clinically possible to differentiate expressive and receptive aphasia. So here with the expressive aphasia, for example, you hear a word, comes into the primary auditory cortex through Wernicke's area, it's still working all right, and then to Broca's area that's going to put together and assemble, it's involved in the final assembly of how the patterned output of the primary motor cortex will be, and then you would express to the external environment the desired behavior, right, or words. And what you would tell somebody to repeat makes perfect sense to them, but then when they hear what they say, it's just shocked, and then they can't express how shocked they are because it just doesn't work. What comes out is, and then most often it's not even close to what was meant or supposed to come out. So these are prime examples where lesions, clinical lesions, and then in experimental animals, experimental lesions of areas of the brain revealed discrete functional localization within the cortical areas. Of course, for this particular function of the nervous system, receptive and expressive aphasia, we really don't have any animal model that would be appropriate, because only humans have this highest level capability of the vocal communication. And then personality, so there's the combination of experience and inheritance, as we know. Schizophrenia is an example to where there's genetic and environmental basis that are involved. So quite often we see in television shows or movies, especially old movies, that they show someone with multiple personality disorder and say they have schizophrenia, and that isn't what schizophrenia is. It is a broad ranging alteration of internal and external environmental misfires and misinterpretations, where voices are generated from within the brain and perceived as possibly coming from outside, even though visually there's no one present to generate those voices, but also in social settings, there can be the perception that people are around them are talking about them, and the voices they're hearing are coming from a person they see near them. And so it is definitely an environmental basis in that sense, that the environmental signals, external and internal, are inappropriately interpreted, and there's hallucinations and things like that, as you might know. But someone that has a genetic predilection to schizophrenia, that takes substances of abuse like a lot of ecstasy, a lot of amphetamine, a lot of cocaine, they are very likely to develop the full expression of the clinical schizophrenia earlier in life than they might have otherwise. So the initial schizophrenic event might occur in high school when they're doing a bunch of drugs, rather than later. But the idea that drug abuse causes schizophrenia is generally not a supported hypothesis. There isn't any strong clinical evidence to support it directly. But certainly, if there's a genetic tendency, predilection, and we don't know how to identify that other than seeing trends in families and genetic groups, and then tracing and seeing the early expression of the full schizophrenic state related to drugs of abuse. But it's presumed, of course, that ultimately they would have emerged. So the emergent properties were an initial part of, in considering the summary of the chapter here, these set of two presentations. We talked about emergency properties, a little bit of the evolution, certainly a lot about the anatomy of the CNS, and we covered the brainstem, the cranial nerves. There's a table of cranial nerves that you should familiarize yourself with in the textbook. Reticular formation, medulla oblongata, somatosensory tract, corticospinal tract, and the pyramids. We've talked about these a bit. We'll spend more time on them when we do the motor and sensory systems physiology. We talked about the various parts of the brain and the spinal cord in more or less detail at different times throughout these two talks. Certainly we talked about the sensory system, the cognitive system, and the behavioral state system, and reminded ourselves about cerebral lateralization by looking at some of these cortical areas and putting them into context. We talked a lot about the primary sensory areas and how these related to association of information and perception of the world, and the reticular activating system as being a big part of the diffuse modulatory systems, circadian rhythms, sleep, motivation and moods, learning, habituation, memory, and consolidation. And hopefully this is occurring in your brain right now, or when you take a little nap or sleep overnight after viewing this presentation. I do appreciate your time and attention. Hope you always remember that. Thank you very much.